Helen, we're gonna mix it up in 5. We're gonna do this right. We're gonna start by introducing ourselves, then we'll introduce the title, then we'll introduce the guests, as if it hadn't taken 4 episodes to sort of come up with a strategy. So, for those who have not listened to the previous podcasts, I'm Ben Williams. I'm with Leprino Foods. Well, that's I should have asked that to start with. But yes, Ben Williams. I work for Leprino Foods. We make mozzarella, and I am responsible for trying to make it as sustainable as possible from farm to customer.
And I'm Helen Brookes, and I'm the engagement director at the UK Agri-Tech Centre. I mean, episode 5. This is crazy. How have we got here so fast?
I don't know, and importantly, and I don't know if there's a small award at the end of this. There probably should be some sort of podcast BAFTA, but I haven't sworn once not as far as the evidence is here. But then we should admit this has been edited. But I haven't, I promise.
No, absolutely not.
So yes, I don't know how we got to episode 5. Episode 5 is a good one, I think, and it's one that we really need to talk about. Because I think this is agriculture's, particularly livestock agriculture's trump card.
Yep.
So the episode title, where there's muck, there's brass. You have to say it in that accent as well.
You have to say it in Northern Brass.
It's the law. You've also got to drink a pint of mild and have a whippet and a flat cap. But that's probably optional.
I think that might just be you.
I do have a flat cap, and actually I've got a whippet. There's no pint of mild. So sequestration is one of those, and I quite often have a conversation with my farmers about sort of, but we're sequestering carbon away, we're doing this public service and we're not getting credit for it, and they're right, actually. Let's be honest, there's a huge amount that's going on farms and various other bits and pieces, yet at the same time there's a bit of a problem. So I'm probably one of those people that is a bit of an oxymoron. Not just a moron, in that I am a member of a local shoot. So part of my conservation efforts involve sort of stalking small feathery birds on a Saturday. It's quite a good shoot because it's the oldest shoot in Shropshire, not in terms of history, but in terms of the average age of the members.
Right.
So the birds stand more than
a slow process.
Yeah, and the birds stand more than a fighting chance. Put it this way. Yeah. We haven't shot a lot, but in the process of it, we look after it all, and it's on a dairy farm, and we were up there in the summer, and we're sat there having dinner, and all the shoot syndicates know what I do for a living, and they tease me all the time about various bits and pieces, and one of them turned around as we were sat having some food, looking at the beautiful rolling countryside with the cows in the field. How can you say this is destroying the planet? And when you looked out of our little loose box where we were sort of sheltered with the quad and various other bits and pieces, you couldn't disagree. You couldn't disagree because you looked at that interplay between grass and cow and atmosphere and soil. It was brilliant. But at the same time, an Arctic load of nitram fertilizer was into the barn behind us, and 17 ton of soy laden feed was into a blown bin, and sort of depending on which way you were looking. So I think, to cut short story shorter, or a long story shorter, the problem is we don't really have the data to fight that corner. We know it's a public good. We've still got some baggage that needs to be sorted, but we're on with that. We've heard that in the previous episodes. But when it comes to soil health, soil management, the solutions and bits and pieces, we need a lot more information to fight our corner. And we need to be a bit honest actually about some of the stuff that we are still yet to do, because some of us are great at soil management.
Yeah,
some of us aren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
There's some work to be done, and I think it's a trump card that we can make more trumpy, more impactful. Yeah. But it's one that we need to discuss. So that's
then we have the lovely labelling of Regen Ag as well to throw into the mix.
Oh, we do sort of briefly talk regen. We do sort of cross the topic. And yeah, it sort of comes up, and for us, for Leprino, I mean, we should probably lay our stall out. We are sort of broadly, globally, we are sort of signed up to the principles under the SAI sort of approach of sort of this is what regen is, and we will support farmers with sustainability action payments for holistic sustainability, which do follow that sort of series of there's about 10 actions under multiple pillars now. But actually, really what I want on a day-to-day basis is I want farmers to look slightly beyond the immediate resources of feed in and cows through the cycle, and just look at some of those fringe elements, but particularly soils and manure management, because there is some serious money to be made.
Yeah. absolutely.
Not just in terms of costs reduced, but actually there's some serious money in terms of sort of gas generation and fuel sources, and there's some really cool stuff there. And we can start to talk about carbon trading, and we can start to talk about nature credits and various other bits, which are very much in infancy and scare me.
Yeah.
But we're at the start point. Yes,
we're at the start point. Yeah. So we've got obviously a great lineup of panelists today on the podcast, including farmers to get their input as well, which is always a mantra of ours.
Absolutely, yeah. So Marcus makes a reappearance. Obviously, we've already picked up with Johnny and whatnot about his intercropping and stuff. So it links back into that. We are going to talk to David from Timac. So Leprino recognised that we just don't have the field staff to go out and do soil carbon testing across our entire range of farms, or even those that do carbon audits for us. But having spoken to Timac, they do have a field team. They do specialise in soil analysis. So we've paid for all of our farmers who want to take a carbon audit to also have soil carbon analysis and all of their macros and micros and pHs and soil structures and mineralisation. 25% of each farm is done in each batch. And what we do is we'll go back in sort of after a 3-year period, and we'll do the same 25%. And people have asked me, why aren't you doing 100% of the farms? And partly because that's very expensive, being really brutal, it is. And also, I had a choice. I could do very few farms and do 100% and then come back sort of in 3 years and find out a trend, or I could do loads of farms and actually sort of get a real spread across sort of the geography of where we operate, and still come back after 3 years and see if there's been a difference. So we saw 25% as a representative sample, but we also had a more than representative sample of farms to analyse. So we're well on our way to about 60 farms this year, full soil carbon panels through well-known laboratories.
Brilliant. So, well, let's talk soil, shall we?
Well, we shall.
And all things muck and brass.
It is worth mentioning also we have the very interesting Sylgen Animal Health. So we have Jeff and Romney joining us. So this is another one of those where if we can think of some of those feed suppliers as offering potential solutions, Jeff and Romney are definitely there. So Leprino needed a sort of a solution for engaging with farmers fairly early on. And Jeff and Romney sort of, I bumped into them. They've been through the Tesco Agri Tea Jam, which for those who don't know what that is, listening in, it's a sort of it's like a competition, a bit like Dragon's Den, I think.
Completely. Dragon's Den. Apply and then go into the Dragon's Den situation.
They do, and they do have a proper Dragon's Den. So it's run by Tesco's, isn't it? And it's all for agri innovations that will make a difference for farmers and supply chain. So their solution is a microbial additive. Doesn't sound particularly new and innovative. There's been sort of slurry additives for a while. That's how I thought it, a magic sprinkle for the poo as opposed to a magic sprinkle for the front end. But actually I think we've started to call it a bioactivator, or a sort of soil bioactivator. And it's interesting because the slurry is the vehicle, and it'll do the things that sort of slurry additives do in terms of crusts and sort of holding on to nutrients. But it's not designed to stay in the slurry. Its design is all about what it does in the soil. And that's where they had a point of difference. That's their innovation. So the fungal species and the bacterial species are so cultured that they create this sort of chain of events within the soil that allow often suboptimal soils with poor pHs and various other bits and pieces to really sort of come to life. So we saw massive increases in sort of yields and optimization of existing minerals, so that phosphates weren't needed, and all sorts of other bits and pieces. So we'll get to hear from them, and then obviously we can sort of set that in sort of the broader piece of soil.
Right, let's get cracking then.
Let's do it.
Hi there, David, and welcome to the podcast. David, if you can just give a quick introduction to yourself and to Timac-Agro to those listening to the podcast, that'd be great, please.
Hi, I'm David Newton. I'm the product manager, technical manager for Timac-Agro UK. Timac-Agro are a crop nutrition and animal health supplement company. working out of our own research facilities in France, but covering about 100 countries around the world with our advanced technologies in crop nutrition, animal health, bedding, supplements, and slurry enhancements.
So Romney, can I just come to you just to introduce yourself and a quick overview of the company itself, and then I'll ask Jeff and Richard to introduce themselves shortly after.
Hi Helen, I'm Romney Jackson and work with Sylgen. Perhaps do more of the technical work than the others. Sylgen specifically manufactures a product that is a slurry additive, but it's more than that. It's aimed at soil health, improving soil health and plant health and productivity.
That's brilliant. Thanks for that, Romney. Jeff, can I come to you just to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Hooper. I'm a ex-vaccine product manager, but I spent 12 years at Grassland Research, so I have a little bit of knowledge about grassland and the interaction between the animals and the sward. But we came together as a group to form this company.
Brilliant. And I think you're being ever so modest there, Jeff, but we'll eke all of that out of you as we go through the podcast. Richard, to yourself, an introduction, please.
Yeah, hi Helen. I'm Richard Brearley. I worked with Jeff and Romney for many years, and I'm director of Sylgen Animal Health. Tend to look after the office side of things and do all the packing and dispatching and logistics, but also get involved in marketing and sales. And as a side, I have my own farm, hill farm in West Wales, with just sheep now. No longer got the cows, but keeps me busy.
Keeps you busy. I can imagine, Richard, how busy you are. In terms of just to sort of kick the conversation off at a quite a high level, what in terms from your point of view, what does good soil health management look like for, you know, the opportune crops that can be grown for the soil type?
When I look at soil health, I break it down into 3 different aspects of soil fertility. You've got physical soil fertility, where you're looking at what type of soil do you have? Is it sand, silt, clay based? What does that mean for you? Because you can't do anything about that. You have to work within the parameters that sets.
Yeah.
But also under that comes, of course, soil structure, which you can have a major influence on. Does the soil suffer from compaction? Does your soil suffer from drying out too fast in the summer, getting too wet in the winter? All of these various different things that can, to a certain extent, be helped by promoting good soil structure, aerating soil, making sure that you're not suffering too heavily from compaction, and where compaction occurs, you're putting in some sort of a remedial action. So that's sort of physical soil fertility. That combines with chemical soil fertility, which again comes down to the type of soil you have, how much clay you have in that, because clay dictates how much nutrition your soil can hang on to. So clay being the sort of the negatively charged element of a soil particle, that helps to hang on to some of the good positively charged soil nutrients, such as potassium, magnesium, calcium, anything that ends in an basically. And that works alongside pH to dictate how available soil nutrients are to those crops that you're growing. Those 2 different elements also are dictated by the biological soil fertility, which is the level of microbial and fungal activity, along with things like earthworms and beetles and the other bugs and nematodes that work together to keep your soil alive. Because in order for a soil to be fertile, it has to be alive. All of those sort of 3 different aspects of fertility are brought together by sort of the combining factor of organic matter. Organic matter feeds the soil biology. It helps with your physical fertility by strengthening soil structure. And it works in chemical fertility by working with the clay and with other things to help to boost those reserves of nutrients within the soil. And of course, organic matter is also a source of nutrition itself by being eaten and broken down by mineralized by soil microbes. It provides nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, sulfur, and various other trace elements for that crop to be used.
So we've obviously been working collaboratively on a project. I unashamedly want some soil organic carbon level data so that we can actually fight the good fight, I think, on farmers' reputation. So, you know, we currently report on gross emissions coming from feed and livestock and bits and pieces on farm, but we've never accounted for the carbon that comes back in that's absorbed on farm, the sequestration figure. So we've obviously commissioned yourselves to go and do the soil carbon testing, but that's not all you do, is it? When you take that soil organic and report back, do you want to talk a bit about sort of what you do on farm, what's measured, and then perhaps what the farmer gets back a little bit, please?
So we're working with yourselves. We're doing one of the more comprehensive soil tests available that measures the sort of the standard parameters of pH, P, K, magnesium, calcium, a few trace elements, but we're also looking at, as you said, the carbon, the organic carbon, the carbon storage, as well as the soil respiration. So we're getting an idea of those microbial activity levels within that soil. And what we can do with that is we can look at current practices of, say, fertilizer, slurry, manure use, look at where the various different nutrient levels are at, where the pH is at, and make advice as to whether or not these practices could be tweaked, be improved to gain higher levels of yield, higher levels of palatability, better forage quality, reduce the amount of fertilizer used. If you're reducing the amount of fertilizer you're using, you're reducing your carbon imprint globally. And it's probably the easiest way for a farm to reduce its footprint is to start looking at things like nitrogen fertilizer. So we all know that fertilizer applications are around between 50 and 60% efficient at best using general commodity fertilizers. So when your soil is also challenged, be it with that pH or be it with some of those, you know, either excess or a deficiency of a nutrient, that efficiency can be challenged even further. So this is where we come in by offering advice, looking at what the farmer has currently, because we're doing a base measurement basically, and looking to see what we can do to help improve the efficiency of that farm.
Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? So I'm obviously after carbon. You've gone in and reported all of those other bits and pieces. So the farmers sort of had you on the farm. And again, we cover 25% of their fields in this sort of trial. But you've been on, you've tested in bits and pieces. What is it the farmer gets back? Because you highlighted there's a hell of a lot more to this than just the carbon bit, which is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, we provide a full report on their soil analysis. We get this, of course, we get the soil testing results, the full soil testing results back. And then we will provide a report on the analysis saying whether or not they are within accepted parameters for things like pH, phosphate reserves, potash reserves, looking at the cattle loading on the farm as well. So whether or not they're within the accepted whether they're not within the accepted loading levels of animals per hectare in order for their manure use to be within the current NVZ regulations.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're looking at a quite a wide range of sort of reporting parameters And we'll make a few recommendations, and if the farmer wants to take that further, we're quite happy to take that further with them as well. Looking at the nutrient efficiencies on farm.
Yeah, because obviously we're not pushing Timac progress here. I've unashamedly paid for some data because we think it's the farmers that are there. The obvious question then is if we're pulling this farm data in bits and pieces, and the farmers are getting that advice back collectively or generally across that pool, are there some common areas that are sort of creeping up over and over again, and you sort of see amongst a lot of farms?
There's what I term it as it's usual for dairy. We see several things
that's not like normal for Norfolk then, because I have heard that, and it's very disparaging against all peoples of Norfolk.
But it is a bit like that, because there's certain things you often see on a dairy farm that are common that sometimes we have to challenge, which is seen as the norm. Organic matter. I gotta say, organic matter generally is high.
Yeah.
Good. Positive.
That's very positive. Grass is the best way to improve organic matter levels within soils. Dairy farms inherently grow a lot of grass. Generally, again, because there's a lot of manure use as well, phosphate and potash levels across the farm tend to be at least within recommended levels of a 2 or above. The problem we get sometimes is that due to the geography of the farm, the manure tends to go to one place or two particular parts of the farm in particular, either by convenience or by, as I say, topography of the farm, which means that you sometimes find that they're getting a little high. So we see indices getting into the 3s, 4s, even 5s sometimes for phosphate and potash, and that's when they start to have influences on other nutrients that aren't a good thing, and they can start to influence some of these bad PR that you see of getting into rivers and causing problems with that. The overriding thing I'm seeing in West Wales with our product is a lot of pHs are suboptimal. There's a lot of farms that are fairly acidic.
So what would be suboptimal for a grassland? Anything below what sort of pH?
Anything below a pH of 6. The RB2 and 9 advice is for grassland 6.2 to 6.5 is around the optimum for growing grass.
Okay.
In terms of nutrient efficiency, if I put on my nutrient management hat,
please do.
6.5 to 7 is where all nutrients are fully available. So as soon as you come below 6.5, you start to have an effect on the availability, particularly of phosphorus within a soil. So we might bring a soil result back to somebody who says that they've got a soil index of, say, 3 for phosphorus. However, if they're at a pH index of around about 5.5 or 5.6, we have to make sure, so that people understand that phosphorus is at best probably 30 to 40% available.
They're chemically bound, basically, just inaccessible.
Yes, iron within the soils binds to that phosphorus and makes it unavailable for plants. And that goes for all of the P fertilizer that's added as well. So
it's literally throwing sort of good after bad almost.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. It's always the first thing that if anyone says, what can we do to improve our farm, is usually we look at the pH levels, we look at liming, because unfortunately times have been tough, and we've been looking at ways to save money on farm, and there isn't a sort of direct cost benefit seen from liming. It's a gradual sort of drip away at the efficiencies of the farm as the pH goes from 6.3 down to 6.1, from 6.1 down to 5.8, and so on.
Okay.
There's an exponential difficulty in correcting that. So with the liming figures, because the measurement of a pH is a logarithmic scale.
Yeah.
A pH of 5.7 is significantly harder to correct than a pH of 6.1, even though they're not very far apart on the scale. You're looking at a vast increase in cost to correct that.
So if that's the case, is there a point where if the pH isn't optimal, is there a point that almost the soil could become saturated in unavailable nutrients to the crop? And then how would you manage that with potentially liming and other management systems?
Yes, I mean it is a combination, and yes, it is. There is a point at that, and you know, I always have to sit there and suck my teeth a little bit whenever I see anything of like pH 5.5 or below, because that's where it starts to get long term to be able to fix it, and it does have a serious impact on the efficiency of all the nutrients that are being put on there. I mean, phosphate is the big one that locks up really easily, but once you get below 5.6, you also have an effect on potash and nitrogen, and a few trace elements as well. So you really are starting to waste money by trying to put fertilizer onto a crop, because it's just getting locked away. So that's when you have to talk to someone like myself or any other sort of nutrition advisor and develop a long-term liming plan to fix these sorts of things, because you're not going to do it in a year, you're not going to do it in 12 months, 2 years. This sort of thing is going to take 5 or even 10 years to correct.
So it's long. We're talking long-term change here, aren't we? But how quickly can that pH become sort of suboptimal?
Again, it doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And it depends on the amount of organic matter. Organic matter is a good thing. However, organic matter does bring acidity to soils. Similarly, certain fertilizers are quite acidic, like triple superphosphate is quite acidic. DAP causes can lead to some certain acidity. Any sort of anything that contains ammonium, so AN, ammonium nitrate, tends to release acidity into the soils. So depending on how much you put on, large amounts of manure use can increase the acidic pressure on soils. And my advice is always, I mean, I happen to work for a company that provides a lot of calcium solutions, so we like people to use calcium every year, but it's not just because I'm paid to do that, it's also a good practice.
Right.
Because calcium is also the sort of the unseen nutrient, or the unspoken about nutrient. But all operations, you know, cows need calcium in order to produce milk, to produce bones, to produce teeth and bones. They're removing calcium from the soils. Plants need calcium for structure, and for water transport and other uses. So they're removing calcium from the soils. So there's around about 100 kilos of calcium is removed from a soil every year per hectare.
Okay.
Thereabouts. We know about having to provide, you know, 100, 200 kilos of nitrogen for a soil, or 50 to 100 to 200 kilos of phosphorus per hectare for a soil, but no one mentions that, yes, that soil probably also needs 100 kilos of calcium every year just to maintain it at the level it's at the moment.
So what I'm hearing is that the impact of pH is a fairly significant one, and with minerals being locked up and therefore less accessible, is this a result of farmers looking to do the right thing from a sustainability point of view, and then maybe ending up with some unplanned consequences? Because longer term grass layers without planning is great for sustainability, but surely it can cause other challenges?
Yeah, very much so. What we have to do now is look at those short to medium term solutions to optimize those minerals, as well as really the longer term strategies to optimize soil pH. I mean, we'll hear from Romney and the Sylgen team now how slurry for soil has been helping in the short term, but actually there is still a role for that in the long term as well. But if we're being really honest, we need to look at long-term liming practices.
Romney, maybe just coming back to you, could you maybe give us a little bit more detail about the product itself and what it is and how it works?
How it works is a tricky one.
Like a magician showing his tricks, Romney.
I'm not sure too many people know the details of how these little microbes work, but there's quite a lot known now. We have 18 different microbials included. Some of these, in fact, many of them work very well in breaking down slurry, so they do work as a slurry additive well. And they break down slurry into very small parts. You get a homogenization of slurry. It reduces the smell. It does all the things that slurry additives, microbial slurry additives, do. But the interesting thing is that we have a mixture of bacteria and fungi, and many of these have different roles in soil and plants. It's how they work is quite tricky because it's very dependent on the plants actually needing them. Plants send out signals when they're going through stress, either abiotic stress like a nutritional deficiency or perhaps drought or flooding or something like this, or even biotic stress where they're under attack from insects, and that's when they're desperate for a bit of help from microbes.
Jeff, I mean, you talked about microbes there in bits and pieces. I mean, there's a chunk of stuff on the market in terms of bacterial additives for busting crusts and bits and pieces. You know, we've got them for the septic tank and whatnot. I'm going to confess up now that sort of we had various conversations early on, and I accused you of witchcraft and wizardry and various other bits. But you mentioned one very, very specific category of microbes that I think, from a soil point of view, we've underestimated. Do you want to expand a little bit on sort of that? Because that's the real difference here, isn't it? We're not just talking about bacteria.
No, we're talking about plant growth promoting rhizobacteria, which tend to form along the roots. In fact, they form a biofilm along the roots, and they're very protective against attack from pathogenic bacteria and other pathogenic beings in the soil. They live off plant exudate. So what you have is root exudate from the plants, which are referred to as rhizodeposits, but plants are very reluctant to send out rhizodeposits unless they're under stress.
Yeah.
And so it's very much a two-way relationship. These bacteria and fungi will support the plant with all sorts of things, with plant hormones. In fact, much of the crosstalk is through plant hormones, with hormones, with nutrients, with water, and the fungi play a very special role with water. We can talk about that in more detail later, but this relationship is very interdependent. The plant needing to need these bugs, and the bugs dying if the plant doesn't need them, because they're just not fed by the plant.
Yeah. So you're right, Romney. I think it's worth picking up on sort of what we see at a plant level sort of in a moment. But if we can nip over to Jeff and Richard, I mean, we can talk about sort of what's in it, and we can talk about the science of bits and pieces, but I'd imagine what a lot of people want to know is what's happened when farmers have used the product. So Jeff and Richard, have you got a couple of case studies or bits that you could sort of give us an example of sort of how it was deployed, what sort of benefits, both broad and quantifiable, the farmers saw, and sort of their general feedback?
Yeah, we've had a wide range of feedback, actually, and I think it's fair to say that everybody that so far used it has been impressed and very happy with the results and the benefits they've had. I mean, the slurry for soil is innovative in that it contains the fungi and bacteria, as Romney has explained, but it does everything that all the other products will do. Certainly as well, Whether it's better or not, I couldn't really say for sure, but certainly it would be as good. So all the crust busting. A lot of farmers have commented on the liquidity of the slurry and the easy mixing and how quickly it mixes and is absorbed into soil. Reduced emissions as well is another big one that people have noticed. But I think where we've stood out is the improved grass yields, but also some of the characteristics of the forage that they've been getting. You know, the quality of the forage, the palatability of the forage seems to have been improved in some cases. Some farmers, in fact, pretty well all farmers have commented that they've been able to use a lot less fertilizer, which, as we all know, is quite expensive at the minute. Although the price has come back now from where it was, it's still a costly commodity. So those are the sorts of feedback we've had. Pretty well all been positive, actually. I can't think of many, if any, negative comments, unless Jeff can think of any.
No, I think the biggest thing I've heard from, I talk a lot to farmers who've been on the trials and that, and they tend to say, well, two things. One is it stays mixed, which is really interesting because it means it's more evenly spread across the pastures when they're spreading it, and it goes in very quickly. One or two farmers have mentioned that they've watched their neighbours and it's still been there 2 weeks later, but theirs has gone into the ground already. Very quick response to the grass, very lush, very green, a very rapid response to the actual, which sort of surprised them compared to what they've been normally seeing with what they've done before. So there's a lot to be said for the farmer's ability to know his farm, to know his grass, to look at his crops and have that awareness from experience. And that's very important for people.
So it looks like slurry for soil has made a really positive impact for the Leprino farmers that have used it so far. Would you agree?
It very definitely has, and that's despite my initial skepticism and calling it magic sprinkles. And it continues to demonstrate more potential, really. So we're looking at assessing its use as a foliar feed, as well as undertaking soil carbon baselining now to look at its long-term impact on soil carbon. I mean, the team at Sylgen will tell you, as great as a product is, actually, it would be even better if we sort the soil pH as well. So the product's more than just a sticky plaster. It does feel, so obviously, I mean, I've come at this from the point of view of organic matter, and the higher the organic matter for me, the better. And talking about this sort of the principles of what you might call regenerative agriculture, or certainly sort of some of the better practices we've sort of pushed to farmers is about maintaining longer term pastures. It's avoiding the plough, which of course is the typical time you'd put lime into soil, plough, reseed, and so on and so forth. Is this one of those examples, possibly in some cases, of where farmers have strived to do the right thing, the best thing that's been advised to them, longer term pasture, longer term lays, avoid the plough? And actually, without perhaps that longer term holistic viewpoint, we might have made ourselves a few problems that we didn't think of.
Yeah, because I totally, absolutely agree. Because the traditional time to add that lime is when you reseed, and people don't tend to put a lot of lime onto established pastures. We don't, it's growing grass. Why should I need it? But it is that gradual drip feed or that gradual sort of chipping away at the fertility of that pasture. And yes, with the sort of the push towards regen, the push towards not moving soil so often, we need to rethink our approach to looking at that liming. Maybe reintroduce a annual, biennial, or triennial approach to adding some sort of buffering capabilities within that soil. And it's different in different parts of the country as well. The west part of the country tends towards the more acidic. The eastern part of the country tends towards the more alkaline. But that's because there's limestone, chalk, or whatever wherever it is, and they're great. That's a great buffer. But where we're on different soils like shales or granites or any of the sort of more moorlandy type soils with high organic matter, we do have this constant pressure. I mean, in some cases where you've got very, very high organic matter in reclaimed moorland and hillsides and things like that, sometimes all you can do is just to buffer that soil acidity with something like a bagged lime or something like that once a year, even just to take the edge off it, so that your own fertilizer can work within that top 10 centimeters of soil. So taking an approach like that, I've worked with people who've done that to sort of really improve their pasture and their growth.
So if you let's assume that you weren't happening to be in the market for selling plenty of calcium-based products, purely independently, of course. If you were to recommend to let's sort of let's go typical dairy farmer who might have sort of 7-year lay, longer term pasture. Let's assume they've sort of ploughed and applied lime at the start. But what would you recommend their course of action be to sort of optimize or make sure that you've got that optimal sort of soil pH? And I know it's dependent on soil type.
It depends on every farm, as I say, and I always say this to every farmer. Every farm is different, but every farmer also knows their farm, so they know historically what sort of pH challenge they're going to have. And the tradition has always been apply lime every 3 years. So if you're in that sort of situation, I would look at having maybe a mid-term review of that pasture. Is it still working? Is it still responding to fertilizer as quickly as it can, or as rapidly as it did in year 1 and 2? Maybe do a soil test. We recommend soil testing at the most every 5 years, and if possible every 3 years, because then you're sort of responding to a fairly sort of concurrent set of results. Once it gets over 3 years, then we can start to see some variations in what we've been testing. So get to know your pastures and get to know your fields. But I say that every 3 years of a liming regime in areas where there's always a pressure. Where we've been testing in West Wales is very similar to where I live down here in Cornwall. We have the same sort of soils, we have the same sort of pressures. And we'll always say, you would look to lime every 3 years if you can.
So liming every 3 years to save 20% on fertiliser costs does seem like a good investment, though.
Yeah, and I think with the right supply of lime, because it has to be the right quality, we'd see a really significant impact not only in sort of standard practices and in terms of fertiliser use, but also when we use innovative solutions such as the soil microbes. I mean, that ROI isn't just from less fertiliser application, when using those soil microbes. The Sylgen team have quantified the impact on the forage quality as well. I mean, Richard's obviously mentioned there about sort of improved sort of forage quality and bits and pieces. Have you got a bit more specifics, Jeff? Because I'm sure with some fellow forage nerds sort of listening in, what might a farmer expect in their silage analysis that'll say this is better, and I'm air quoting there as in a sort of slightly ironic way?
Yes, the analysis of grass has been interesting actually, because you can see a distinct difference because of the trials were set up between treated and untreated slurry on the same group of cows, but different slurry lagoons. The Dutchy trial that we ran, there was a good evidence from the data that it showed that the metabolizable energy was up, the sugar content was up, the NDF was down. And so it's quite interesting. You can see the results distinctive from the actual analysis of the grass. And we are doing some more on the silage because we were hoping that will flow through into the silage. But some of the nutrient contents are also interesting because of calcium and magnesium and nutrient transfer, which is facilitated by the fungi, helping to bring these micro elements into the plants and so on. So there's an awful lot of interactions going on in the plant.
Okay.
Romney might like to add to that. I don't know.
Yes, I'd say that you mentioned the fact that we're getting a lower NDF and raised sugar, and in general, what we're seeing is better palatability of the grass.
Yeah.
I would agree with you that not just the fungi, but also the bacterial microbials are very good at transporting minerals. And you see in the grass analysis, almost in every occasion, a very significantly raised oil A in the analysis, which indicates higher levels of solubilized minerals within the grass, and that's all part of the mineral transport. I think I'd pick out the fact that we had one of the biggest problems when doing farm studies is getting lots of data back from the farmer, because very often you get sort of partial data back, and we had 3 nice lots of data last year, plus a more formal trial at the Duchy College. And if we look at what they were getting, we had one farmer that was getting a 30% higher dry matter yield, he reckoned, with a total reduction of nitrogen of 37.5%. The next farmer down, if you like, reduced had a similar dry matter yield to previously, but he'd reduced his nitrogen by 18.8%. Another farmer had a 22% higher dry matter yield on 14% less nitrogen, and then the Duchy had 24% higher yield on 4 of the cuts. One cut, unfortunately, wasn't measured, but used the same amount of fertilizer. And fascinatingly, when you put that on a graph, you see that, and you start taking a look at what the return on investment was, because the return on investment of the first guy that I read out was about nearly £16 on every pound spent on slurry for soil. The return on investment of the Duchy, and they didn't reduce their fertilizer at all, was only £6 for every pound.
Considerable though, Romney. That's not a drop in the ocean, is it?
Still good, but what's interesting is your return on investment is much higher when you reduce your inputs. So there's a real advantage to reducing inputs.
So could Duchy have reduced their inputs, their fertilizer inputs, based on the data?
They could have done, and they are doing this year, yes, or they have done this year.
So having a known return on investment is great, and I'm not denying that. But in terms of sort of behaviour change, we know that that's not necessarily going to drive uptake and actually change action on farm all the time.
No, that's definitely the case. But looking at the reset model, which we get to discuss in our next exciting instalment, we do have other levers facing our farmers, in particular the farming rules, regulations, sometimes referred to as MVZ regulations, mean we are going to have to be smarter about how we manage our nutrients. And solutions such as slurry for soil, therefore, has a significant potential benefit for supporting compliance, but at the same time, still optimising those yields from forage.
Farming in an NVZ is going to require some good planning and, probably just as importantly, good record keeping. We can discuss this with David from Timac-Agro and the best way to do that whilst getting the most value from your farm.
And when you're talking about those sort of every 3 years or maybe 4 years, from a management point of view, and I know it depends on the farm and the farm size, would splitting the growing area of the farm into, say, thirds or quarters and doing a third every year, so you get that 3-year rotation, or quarters and do it every 4-year rotation, is that a sensible approach to do that, or would you rather farmers went, okay, I'm going to do the whole hog every 3 years? How does that vary?
My heart sinks when I have to do a whole farm, A, because it's a lot of work, but B, also because you are only taking a snapshot of that farm that year. If you're doing, as you suggest, if you split the farm into a certain amount per year, that you cover the whole farm within that sort of 3, 4 or 5 year period, it's much easier on your cash flow, because the outlay is spread over the time, and B, you're keeping an eye on any maybe seasonal variations or annual variations. I would recommend that you test at the same time every year, so that because within the year you can get variations in pH, you can get variations in P and K levels. So set a sort of a month of the year in which your soil tests are carried out, and then that should give you an indication of, and as I say, split it out. So you're doing some grazing, some silage, some cropping land if that's what you do, every time. So you're starting to sort of build a picture of each platform on an annual basis. Because that data is much more useful than just a snapshot once every 4 years.
And you can create patterns through that, I suppose, as well, can't you? You can start to understand the potential patternation of that particular lot of pasture.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So so obviously you've talked there about, there's obviously a financial cost to liming, but there's obviously a return on investment there for greater fertilizer efficiency, given the price of fertilizer, particularly the last year or two. So I'm going to go out to market. I'm going to buy myself some calcium. Obviously you don't go out and buy sort of some calcium powder. That would be entertaining, I'm sure. So how am I buying it, and is all calcium created equal?
No is the answer.
I was worried that would be the case.
There's lots of different liming products. You've got from what we would know as agricultural lime, which is a powder. There's different grades you can get of that, whether it's ground chalk, ground limestone. British Sugar make a product called Limex, which is a byproduct of the sugar manufacturer. It depends which quarry it comes from, how finely it's ground, because the more finely it's ground, the faster it will act, because it's got more surface area. The solubility
isn't all it cracked up to be. I mean, if you're really in a bad state, do you want fast acting lime, or do you want something that's a bit slower actually?
If you've got really bad, you don't want very rapidly acting, because it's like it's just a very short-term sticking plaster over what the problems you've got. Something that some people use is shell sand as well, and that's one of the slower acting means to an end. However, it does over long term, and especially if you start getting a program of using that, either using it in your cubicles as a cubicle bedding, and then it goes out with the slurry. It starts to build quite nicely within your soils, to the extent that I've actually found people that have had to come off shell sand and cubicle bedding because their pHs have got to sort of 7.3, 7.4, and they've gone too high.
Interesting.
But that's quite a nice one for a dairy farm to use.
And would that be surface applied, sort of topological, or would you have to sort of?
No.
So you wouldn't have to integrate. You wouldn't have to plough it in or anything like that.
No. One of the common misconceptions is that lime has to be ploughed in. It doesn't. Calcium carbonate will, once it's soluble, will infiltrate into the soil. So long as you have a decent soil structure and soil profile, just like organic matter, it will be taken down into the soil. So
I suppose that comes back to your point about the soil being alive. Is actually to enable it to be taken down, that soil does need to be active or alive, for want of a better word.
And of course there are the other extreme from shell sand or something like that is something like a bagged prilled lime. They tend to be a lot faster acting. So they're quite good for topping up people that aren't too bad, 6.1, 6.2, even 6. Getting down to sort of 5.9, you can work with a bag lime. But that tends to be part of an annual or a biennial program rather than a sort of 3 or 5 year program.
Okay. That's like the maintenance dose then. Going back to what you were saying before about that bit that's taken out every year, come rain or shine, that's your top up.
Yeah. But the thing about a bag lime, it brings more convenience because you can spread it yourself.
Yes.
Ground limestone requires a contractor, requires a piece of kit that doesn't like steep hills or soft ground. Whereas with a bag lime, with a prilled lime or similar, you can spread that yourself. You have your own flexibility as to when you spread that and when you can use it. And it's also useful on things like rented or tenanted ground where you're not wanting to invest huge amounts into someone else's land. But if you've got something for 2 or 3 years just to grow some silage or something like that on it, that can give you that ability to buffer that problem.
And we can't discuss nutrient management planning without the topic of data coming up time and time again, and the value that farmers can therefore get from it. Romney, in the trials, Sylgen collects a range of data.
Really, just much more grass and more palatable grass have been the two things that they've really commented on. Handleability is the other thing. In other words, when they've been spreading the slurry, it's gone into the soil. It's been grazable much sooner after spreading because it's been much more liquid, so it's not been sitting on top. Probably one of the biggest advantages too is that this has been a benefit that's gone through the whole summer season, so that they've applied maybe once or twice at the beginning of the season, and they've seen increased yields throughout the season.
There's one other thing I would bear in mind, Romney. We did have one case where they noticed an increase in butterfat, which really was contrary to what we'd expected with a reduced NDF. So it's quite interesting feedback from a farmer who said, I can see an increase in butterfat.
So I went to an interesting talk actually at the Total Dairy that might sort of explain some of that, because obviously you've got, even with NDF, you've got high quality NDF, you've got low quality NDF, and then obviously you've got sort of, the impact of chop length and various other bits and pieces across those. And actually, just because the NDF was lower perhaps in sort of its prevalence on a dry matter basis, it may well have been a better quality fibre overall, in which case you might have seen something. But then of course we could also accept that maybe the farmer had done a slightly different chop length on it that year and various other bits. But there are elements. It's definitely something that could be dug into. I'd like to pick up on just a couple of those bits that weren't quantified, because obviously, Romney, you talked about sort of some grass analysis and bits and pieces there. But actually, Jeff, you've picked up on that usability. I mean, there are things coming across the UK in terms of how we apply our slurries, that this seems sort of geared up to almost assist. Not only is it going to pay for itself, but I'm thinking low emission spreading technology, dribble bars, trailing shoes. Do you see a role for farmers who are sort of supporting the usability of other technologies from something like this?
Yes, I think it's all contributory. I think the whole lot go together. I think one of the major things about the fungi that are in here is that they produce a lot of ligninases and cellulases, which will break down the fibres to much smaller particulate. So that's why it stays homogeneous. And one farmer commented, it's just like custard, he said, and it stays mixed and I don't have to remix it. Now, that's an important thing because he's reducing his fuel to keep mixing it every sort of 5 or 6 loads or something. He was actually having to mix his slurry, which is costing a lot of diesel. So these things all contribute to the emissions.
Well, obviously, when we spoke to Marcus, he was talking about a couple of £100 worth of diesel actually as well. So it's not a small volume of diesel here we're talking about. I mean, not something you've quantified, Romney, I presume, in the ROI at this point, but
no, we haven't.
But something that could be thought about.
To be fair, we've only looked at ROI on nitrogen, so we haven't even calculated phosphates and potassium fertilizer. So we've just looked at a simple nitrogen.
Very, very conservative then when you're sort of making your figure claims and bits and pieces, because it can sound a bit of a bold return, can't it, 16 to 1, but actually it is genuinely quite conservative.
I
think
think
that's
I'd pick up on the phosphorus there, Romney, because
Yeah.
the phosphorus is really interesting. We've learned a lot in the last 2 years about phosphorus, which we weren't really aware of. I mean, you know, college days, decades ago, it was a very simple analysis of soil to quantify the type of soil it was, the pH and the nutrients in it. And that's as far as it went. Now you're talking about a whole biology, a whole different scenario of what farmers could be looking at in their soil. And that's a difficult element because it's something you can't quantify from an analysis of slurry itself. It's a biological effects.
Yeah, Richard, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm just going to, a couple of points to pick up on actually, is that one farmer I was chatting to made a comment that he accidentally dumped a load of old silage into his slurry lagoon. And he was surprised that having used slurry for soil, the silage had all gone by the time he came to mix it. It had actually been digested. So it's just emphasising the efficiency of the product in breaking down organic and fibrous material. And we shouldn't underestimate actually the savings that can be made in the need to stir the slurry and in spreading the slurry. And a number of farmers I know, with stagnant slurry, you get crusting and sludging, and it can take a lot of tractor time. And you're talking about tractors running at quite high revs for hours and constantly over 2 or 3 days even to spread these big lagoons and stir the slurry. And farmers are telling us that they can stir it in a fraction of the time, and that's a huge saving which hasn't really been fully costed in our ROI. So the returns could be potentially even better.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, those returns, you haven't maybe brought in the fuel use and certainly time. Something that all farmers say they're poor on, and something we've touched on in a previous podcast as well, which has been fantastic. So yeah, all of those types of things, they're almost those. I mean, quantitative in terms of fuel costs, but qualitative in terms of in time and time saved as well, which is hard to put into a return on investment sort of evaluation, but an absolutely key one for the farming community and the industry as a whole.
And I think
not to forget blockages either, because blockages, I mean, what a nice job and a nice day to have to unblock a slurry spreader, you know.
It's a lovely one.
We talk about fertilizer prices a lot because they're very keen, but we shouldn't underestimate, farmers will tell you fuel prices, and I know myself, they've increased dramatically. Red diesel itself is a lot more expensive than it was a few years ago, and that's a big cost.
Well, thanks to innovations such as slurry for soil, we can make some fairly rapid changes to soil health, but it still strikes me that we need to take some longer term strategies.
But changing soils is a geological process, so it takes time. We can't deny that. But we can talk to David more about what those strategies can look like.
So it almost comes back to sort of setting that goal. So I suppose the key, I mean, because we've talked about measurement and various other bits and pieces, but you talk about sort of measuring worst case every 5 years, sort of ideally sort of every 3. Is that because really you need to sort of have a 5-year ambition for that land because that's the time it takes to sort of really make any shifts? Or is what's the importance of starting with a goal?
Yes, I mean, it's hugely important to start with a goal. But yeah, first off, farming rules for water state that you need to soil test your land every 5 years at least.
Yeah.
So it's sort of within the UK legislation now that we have to soil test the ground. The doing it every 3 years rather than 5 years gives you a more up-to-date picture that you're working with, and you find that the more go-ahead farmers who have plans, who have goals, who have an active interest in progressing their farms tend to be those that are more data driven,
right?
And so are more into or more keen to actually harvest that data on a more regular basis. So looking at those sort of things, we can look at things like where do you feel that your silage is underperforming? Is there a problem? What is your priority? Are you a grazing led farm? Are you a silage led farm? What is your production priorities?
And it's about collecting that data from below the ground as well as above the ground. And we've, in
Yes.
in others of these podcast series, we have sort of talked about obviously sort of, grass measurement and grass utilisation, but actually that below ground is just as important to get that data from to maximise the above ground growth.
Well, it all starts below ground, doesn't it?
Yep, absolutely.
The growth that you see above ground, and everyone forgets that without roots, you don't grow, you don't get top growth.
Absolutely.
And looking at various different articles and various different grazing regimes as to how tight you graze things to leave more roots or to harvest those roots.
Without good root establishment, you don't get the regrowth up the top because
exactly.
It just gets ripped out.
Exactly. Yeah.
So those farmers that have either brought in land that perhaps has been managed in a very traditional way of sort of is all been about trying to push chemical fertility perhaps, or for those farms that are sort of looking now to sort of perhaps change their approach, or those that have just genuinely tried to do the right thing, push, remove the plough, push for long-term lays and various other bits and pieces. If you were to give them sort of a 5-point plan, very broad 5-point plan, sort of this is the first job you do and these are the next sort of 3 or 4 tasks that I would recommend, what might that look like? What's the first thing they should do?
First thing is, of course, is soil test.
Yeah. And when you say soil test, are we going just NPK?
Take that soil test a little bit further with things like organic matter, calcium, looking at sulfur trace elements as well. Put a spade in the soil, find out where your compaction is. The most underused resource that a farmer has is a spade, and the most sort of, or the biggest cries of revelation I've ever heard from farmers has been when I've taken a spade out onto a farm to an underperforming paddock and they expect me to come back with some sort of chemical reason that there's an interaction between the magnesium or whatever it is, and I jump on a spade and it doesn't go more than an inch into the ground. And I point out to them the reason that field is underperforming is because you can't grow roots and the water's not penetrating, air's not penetrating, and so on. So compaction is the cheapest thing to fix and the easiest thing to find.
I presume with compaction that the answer is leave it alone.
There's 2 things you can do. You can leave it alone. Well, actually, several things you can do. You can leave it alone. Personally, I'm a big fan of soil slitting within a grassland regime, at least once a year, especially in grazing fields. There's looking at the species that you're growing as well, depending on what will grow in your area, having a variety of roots, variety of root depths.
Yeah.
Going into your soil to help with that as well. It helps break up any structure, helps encourage soil life to get deeper as well.
And this is where herbal lays and the advantages, I suppose, where they have been seen, where they've been managed appropriately. This is one of their assets. Yeah,
very, very good. Having a wide variety of rooting depths incredibly increases the soil's capacity to store water throughout a greater depth. And in some of these hotter, drier summers that we've been having, or longer dry periods that we've been having, not necessarily hot, even cold dry periods, we've seen grass just stop growing through lack of moisture. If you can store moisture in the top 30 centimetres of the soil rather than the top 10 centimetres of your soil, you're giving yourself a much bigger reserve for that crop to draw from. So that's where we're looking at having, a good soil structure down to 30 centimetres at least, if we can, if you have 30 centimetres of soil, of course.
So we've got soil testing, we've got identify soil compaction. Any other top tips?
How you use your muck and when you spread it is another.
Within the existing legal frameworks, of course.
Within all legal frameworks, of course.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we're all nodding enthusiastically at that for those obviously on this radio style transmission.
But
Yeah.
seeing it as an asset and using it appropriately at the right time of year. So, slurry in the spring, manure, farmyard manure, late summer, early autumn, that sort of split, being able to, store your farmyard manure until the late summer, compost it slightly so it goes away quicker. Don't be tempted to spread it straight out of the barn quite so quickly, because it feeds your soil biology so much better if you allow it to compost for 3 to 6 months before you spread it, because you're lowering the carbon nitrogen ratio, making it better bacterial food.
And that's a very convenient segue into the value of soil microbes and soil biodiversity.
It was almost like we planned it. It is. Romney, you mentioned something that I think it's worth picking up on, and it's sort of jiggered back in my brain now. You talked about farmers applying this early in the year and seeing almost sort of a legacy effect.
Yeah.
Is that because, I suppose we need to talk about the importance of that, but sort of why is that potentially valuable? Seeing that sort of legacy effect and sort of the impact on soils. Why is it so good potentially?
Well, farmers are used to adding fertilizer to the soil or slurry and getting a reasonably immediate response, but then having to repeat 6 weeks later with the next cut of silage, etc., in order to get any further response, in that you get very little leftover nitrogen, if you like, as long as it's rained, in between each cut. The advantage of having microbials is that they're working the whole time, particularly if there is not a excess nutrient in the soil already. So plants depend very much. For instance, we were talking about phosphate earlier, or Jeff was, and phosphate is very much one of the limiting factors. If you have too much phosphate, plants tend to feel very comfortable that they're getting enough nutrition, and they don't send out signals to these bacteria and fungi to say that they need feeding. But as long as phosphate isn't in excess, there tends to be some level of relationship with these microbials. Interestingly, of course, once plants begin to depend on these microbials will mine almost every mineral, and not only the bacteria, but for instance, a fungus is able to produce over 100 meters of mycelia in just 1 cubic centimeter of soil. And it's mining not only the minerals, but the water in that, and will be able to supply far more water than the plant can possibly manage through its own roots. So we're looking at a real subsidiary aid to mining both minerals and water from these microbials all through the summer while they're there. Well, in fact, as long as you don't leave bare soil over the winter, which in a grassland situation you don't have, these microbials will just keep going.
And soil microbes are impacting business sustainability and environmental sustainability. But what about soil carbon?
Yeah, so sequestration or absorbing carbon dioxide in soils, trees, hedgerows, so on and so forth, is agriculture's great trump card. And importantly, we haven't played it yet. This is really because we do need better data to ensure whatever claim we're putting in front of customers or ultimately consumers holds up to, let's face it, the significant scrutiny it will bring. And David can tell us a bit more. Picking up on the biology there, and I suppose bringing this back full circle to that sort of announcement of the purpose of this sort of relationship between sort of Leprino and Timac and our farmers. I've obviously talked about soil organic matter and sequestration there. We get onto the subject of carbon generally. I mean, broadly, where do you see the importance of carbon and measuring carbon over the next sort of 5 to 10 years? Is it going to be a big thing?
It's going to be huge, because we have to do something about the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And farming has one of the biggest opportunities to get in on this and cash in on this. And I say that with a huge amount of trepidation.
Over the cashing in component.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Because there's a lot of schemes, and I'm not even going to start to be drawn on my views on carbon credits and carbon the carbon
Staying
markets.
on the safe side, David.
You're amongst friends, don't worry.
Because there's various different metrics that people are using, and
Yeah.
some are good and some are not so good. But by taking soil organic matter, by increasing the carbon stored within the soils, and especially by taking it down to depth, is one of the most effective and easiest and cheapest ways we can help to reduce the carbon dioxide burden globally. As a company, we're part of the 1% project, which is specified that if all agricultural land in the world increased its organic matter by 1%, we'd solve global warming overnight. So that's that's the effectiveness of it.
So 1%, that's, I mean, 1% is nothing in the grand scheme of it, is it? 1%. So we'll have that done at the end of the week, David. Or really, if we're being honest, and we're bringing this again, sort of, joining all of these bits and pieces up. I suppose we all need to measure our organic carbon to figure out how difficult that job is, surely, because I mean, how long does it take to move 1%?
Yeah, it all starts by knowing what is the base level.
Yeah.
And to do that, you have to first measure it.
Okay.
And so if we're doing soil, if you're soil testing already, adding in a carbon test is literally about £5 or £10 a test. It's nothing much.
And if your processor was offering to pay for it, I suppose, does that make it better?
Even better.
Fair enough. Okay. So there's a real piece to support our reputation, and actually then is genuinely continue being more than just the food on people's plates.
Yes. No, I mean cattle farmers take a bashing all the time. We're an easy target due to the emissions associated with global cattle farming. And this is an opportunity for us to redress some of that balance, because alongside some of the obvious shortcomings of cattle farming, there was a hell of a lot of good that was being done, especially in places like the UK, where we are a forage-based system. So by measuring it, by quantifying it, we then start to have an argument to fight back against some of the naysayers that we have with very loud voices around the world.
So how does the Timac soil testing programme link with the Sylgen and Slurry for Soils as part of a long-term strategy? Because I need to get my head around that.
Yeah, well, when we discovered the challenges of soil pH and phosphates through the Timac programme, we realised we needed that short-term solution to kickstart some soil recovery, for want of a better word. And looking at the work and research Sylgen have been undertaking, there was a good chance that supporting a more diverse soil microbiome would not only fix some of our short-term problems, but it might also build some more soil organic matter or carbon. And I think Sylgen can explain it a little more. So Timac have talked about some of the work they've been doing around the analysis, and I know we're going to tie this project in, particularly looking at the organic content long term, but they talked about particularly pH challenged soils where phosphate is going to be locked away, and I'm starting to feel some connections coming in my own brain. Maybe there's some mycelial work going on there, but those fungi in a pH challenged soil where you've got maybe this inaccessible phosphate, is that what they're doing? Are they mining that phosphate and bringing it back? Is that the sort of the secret to their power?
They do mine the phosphate, but they do it simply by putting acid on the phosphate. So you have very localized acid secretion by the bacteria and the fungi, and they'll mine phosphate using their own acid. So actually, the pH of the soil is neither here nor there when it comes to these to these microbials. They will overcome the problem, and they will actually eventually change the soil to what's needed, as long as you're not putting too much other stuff on. If you're flooding it with NPK, then you're completely working against all the microbials.
I think one of the things here is to consider is that if the soil hasn't got the bacteria and fungi that it needs, they've been depleted over many decades, really, probably because of the increased use of synthetic fertilizers, then when the soil is deficient of these, how can it suddenly respond to the need? So if they're not there, so these bacteria and fungi aren't there in sufficient quantity, probably to really react quick enough. So I think that may be a factor to take into consideration. In effect, the soils become lazy. The plants have become lazy by being provided everything they want. And
so we've almost taken the complexity out, that biodiversity out of the soil, and what you're doing in effect is putting it back, or at least starting to.
Yeah, I think over time it's interesting to see long term, year after year, what effect this has, whether you can actually transition away from using so much synthetic fertilizers, and it's a big thing, because if you know, the worst thing a farmer can have is there's not enough silage in his store, and it's a long winter.
Yeah.
And so the fear is that you haven't got enough grass grown, and you conserved enough. In a good year, sometimes you've got some extra silage left, and in a bad year you've run out, and what do you do then? Because everyone's run out.
And in previous conversations, we've talked about some nutrients like nitrogen, for example, being.
Absolutely. I have to say, David, thank you massively for joining us and supporting this podcast series, and actually, obviously, then the continued support for the Leprino Timac and Leprino Farmer project, where we can actually sort of gather that evidence to fight back against those naysayers. So thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of podcast number 5. Ben, any thoughts on some of those key points that have been raised through our fantastic contributors?
Yeah, well, I think as we started this podcast, I used the phrase trump card, as in soil is sort of that great asset we haven't yet played in reporting down to customers all of the carbon benefits that can come from looking after it. I think, although it is that trump card, we've heard there from David, Romney and Marcus, obviously, whilst it has the potential, there is a lot of work still to be done. We have pushed our soils, driven by policy and driven by practice, to sort of yield as much as possible, but we probably haven't always looked after them to their fullest. There's high phosphate indices in some of our soils. There's a pH challenge across our soils, and the biology needs a bit of support. So there's a chunk of work to be done, really, before we can play that trump card.
Yeah, and I think especially, well, some of the themes that have really come out have been sort of that short-term versus long-term approach. And short-term, obviously, we've got to get our soils into a better condition. But long-term, those long-term approaches, thinking about soil pH, thinking about the use of slurry additives more as vectors, then that's the approach that we need to be getting the whole industry to think about, isn't it? Versus short-term and long-term.
Yeah, and I think the long-term is quite daunting. And to be fair to farmers, we've talked about long-term pastures and long-term lays, and a lot of those strategies that build on that long-term sort of fertility, they fall out of the natural cycle. Rather than every 3 to 5 years and ploughing and releasing carbon, we're not doing that, which is great. But then applying the lime and sort of those neutralizing agents doesn't happen as frequently, and it's sort of, how do I build that practice in? And I think, as David talked about there, it's coming up with a long-term plan, but then also using those opportunities for slurry additives to sort of realize very sort of short-term rewards is absolutely important. I mean, we've seen about an 18% average yield increase where that Sylgen product has gone in. and some really positive, albeit more qualitative assessments from farmers. So we had one chap sort of phone them up, just quite gleeful at the problem he'd now found himself with, because it normally took 149 acres to fill their clamps. They'd filled them within 109, and actually they still had grass to cut, and they were looking at who could come and bale it for them, which, you know, given the challenging years we've had, is a really nice problem to have.
Absolutely. So
I think there's some short-term rewards that can sort of get us on the journey, but it's all about that long-term plan. You've got to rebuild biology and chemistry. You can't just sort of throw microbes at this and go, oh well, that's fixed it. There's a long-term strategy to be had.
Yeah, really like that approach. Really like that approach. Well, I've certainly learned a lot today. And again, thank you to everyone who has contributed to the podcast. We couldn't do it without you. So next up, obviously, onwards and upwards onto podcast number 6 for us. So we've got some great things for everyone to look forward to. And I think in terms of really looking at farmers' approaches to change. And the support that is actually needed, both from the farming community and straight across the supply chain. So I'm really looking forward to that. Obviously looking forward to speaking to you again, Ben. So speak to you all soon.
Brilliant. Thank you.